The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benning, Georgia, as Private Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his ill-fitting uniform for what felt like the 100th time. The fabric hung loose on his slight frame, a constant reminder that he didn't quite fit the mold of what everyone expected a soldier to be. At 5'6" and barely weighing 140 pounds, Marcus looked more like he belonged behind a desk than on a battlefield. "Rodriguez, front and center!" Drill Sergeant Williams's voice boomed across the training ground, cutting through the humid Georgia air like a knife. Marcus jogged forward, his boots squelching in the red clay mud that seemed to be permanently embedded in every corner of the base. "Yes, Drill Sergeant!" Marcus snapped to attention, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Williams circled him like a predator, his weathered face set in its usual scowl. "Tell me, Rodriguez, what exactly made you think you had what it takes to be a soldier? Did you get lost on your way to the library?" Snickers erupted from the other recruits standing at attention nearby. Marcus felt heat rise to his cheeks, but kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. This wasn't new. He'd been hearing variations of this question since the day he'd arrived at basic training 3 months ago. "I enlisted to serve my country, Drill Sergeant," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Serve your country?" Williams laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the nearby barracks. "Son, you can barely complete a 10-mile run without collapsing. Yesterday you couldn't even climb over the wall obstacle. How exactly do you plan to serve anybody?" The other recruits' laughter grew louder. Marcus recognized the faces. Johnson, the former high school football star from Alabama. Peterson, who'd grown up hunting in the Montana wilderness. Davis, whose father and grandfather had both been Marines. They all looked like they'd stepped out of a military recruitment poster, all broad shoulders and confident grins. "Maybe he can serve coffee," Johnson whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, triggering another wave of laughter. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides but maintained his composure. He thought about his grandmother, Elena, back in San Antonio, Texas. She'd raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. Every night, she'd tell him stories about his great-grandfather who'd fought in World War II, and his uncle Miguel, who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam. "Mijo," she'd said the night before he left for basic training, her weathered hands holding his face. "They will try to break you down because you are different. But remember, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. You have something they cannot see yet, but one day they will." "Drop and give me 50, Rodriguez," Williams commanded. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time building some muscle, you might actually make it through training." Marcus dropped to the ground and began his push-ups. The red clay was cool against his palms, and he focused on the rhythm. Up, down, up, down. Around him, he could hear the continued whispers and jokes from his fellow recruits. "Bet he doesn't make it past week 16, Peterson muttered. "I give him 2 more weeks, tops," Davis added. "My money's on him washing out during the final field exercise." As Marcus struggled through his push-ups, his arms trembling with the effort, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his recruiter back in San Antonio. Staff Sergeant Martinez had looked at Marcus's slight build and hesitated before handing him the enlistment papers. "Son, I'm going to be straight with you," Martinez had said, leaning back in his chair in the small recruiting office. "The Army isn't easy, especially for someone your size. Have you considered other branches of service? Maybe the Air Force? They've got great technical programs." But Marcus had shaken his head. "I want to be infantry sergeant. I want to be where the action is." Martinez had studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, kid, but you're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove yourself." Now, as Marcus's arms gave out at push-up number 37, he wondered if everyone had been right. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. Maybe he should have listened to his high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd encouraged him to apply for college scholarships instead of enlisting. "Get up, Rodriguez," Williams barked. "You can finish those later. Right now I want you to run the obstacle course, and this time try not to embarrass yourself in front of the whole company." Marcus struggled to his feet, his arms still shaking from the incomplete set of push-ups. The obstacle course stretched out before him like a nightmare of wooden walls, rope climbs, and mud pits. He'd attempted it dozens of times and had never completed it within the required time limit. As he approached the starting line, he could see other recruits gathering to watch. Some looked genuinely sympathetic, but most wore expressions of anticipation, as if they were about to witness another spectacular failure. "On your mark," Williams called out, stopwatch in hand. Marcus crouched into position, his heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the weight of everyone's expectations, or lack thereof. The morning sun climbed higher, and sweat was already beading on his forehead. Get set. He thought about Elena's stories, about men who'd faced impossible odds and somehow found a way to persevere. He thought about the flag folded in the trunk back in his room, the one that had covered his Uncle Miguel's coffin. "Go!" Marcus launched forward, his legs pumping as hard as they could carry him. Behind him, he could hear the voices of his fellow recruits, some cheering half-heartedly, others making bets on exactly where he'd fail this time. But as he approached the first obstacle, something shifted inside him. The voices faded into background noise, and all he could hear was his grandmother's voice echoing in his memory. "You have something they cannot see yet, but one day they will." 6 months later, the desert heat of Afghanistan hit Marcus like a physical blow as he stepped off the transport plane at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The air shimmered with waves of heat rising from the tarmac, and the smell of diesel fuel and dust filled his nostrils. Despite completing basic training, barely scraping by the minimum requirements, the doubts that had followed him from Fort Benning seemed to have made the journey across the world with him. "Welcome to paradise, boys," Staff Sergeant Thompson called out to the new arrivals, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd seen too many fresh faces come and go. "Hope you enjoyed your flight, because this is where the real training begins." Marcus shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of his gear pulling at his shoulders. Around him, his fellow soldiers from basic training looked equally overwhelmed by the stark landscape of brown mountains and endless desert stretching in every direction. Johnson, who'd continued to mock Marcus throughout their training, whistled low under his breath. "Man, this place looks like the surface of Mars," Johnson muttered, shaking his head. Peterson nodded in agreement. "My dad fought in Desert Storm, but he never described anything like this." Marcus remained quiet, taking in the fortified walls of the base, the guard towers, and the constant hum of generators that provided power to this isolated outpost. He'd spent the flight reading intelligence briefings about their area of operations, the volatile Kunar province, where Taliban fighters moved freely through mountain passes that had been used by smugglers and warriors for centuries. "Rodriguez!" Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice cut through his observations. "You're with Alpha Squad, 3rd Platoon. Report to Sergeant First Class Morrison. That's your squad leader, and try not to get yourself killed on your first day." Marcus found Morrison near the armory, a weathered man in his 30s, with premature gray streaking his temples and scars on his hands that spoke of multiple deployments. Morrison looked up from cleaning his rifle as Marcus approached. "You must be my new replacement," Morrison said, his tone neutral but assessing. "I heard about you from Thompson. Small guy, barely made it through basic, right?" "Yes, Sergeant," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady, despite the familiar sting of being defined by his limitations. Morrison set down his rifle and studied Marcus carefully. "Let me tell you something, kid. Out here, size doesn't matter as much as heart and brains. I've seen big, tough guys fold under pressure, and I've seen skinny kids like you save entire squads. The question is, which one are you going to be?" Before Marcus could answer, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the rest of Alpha Squad. There was Rodriguez, a stocky Mexican-American from Los Angeles, who shared Marcus's last name but no relation. Williams, a soft-spoken medic from rural Kentucky, and Hayes, a machine gunner from Detroit whose arms looked like tree trunks. "Fresh meat," Hayes announced with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope you're better than the last replacement we got." "What happened to the last replacement?" Marcus asked, immediately regretting the question when he saw the expressions on their faces. "IED got him on his second patrol," Rodriguez said quietly. "Kid named Patterson. Good soldier, just unlucky." The weight of that statement settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. This wasn't basic training anymore, where the worst consequence of failure was push-ups or extra duty. Here, Mistakes could be measured in body bags. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus threw himself into learning everything he could about their area of operations. While other soldiers spent their downtime playing video games or writing letters home, Marcus studied maps, memorized the names of local villages, and learned basic phrases in Pashto from their interpreter, a young Afghan man named Ahmadi. "Why do you work so hard?" Ahmadi asked one evening as Marcus practiced pronunciation of common greetings. "The other soldiers, they do not try to learn our language." Marcus looked up from his notebook, where he'd been writing phonetic spellings of Pashto phrases. "Because I need to understand. If I'm going to help protect people, I need to know who they are and what they're saying." Ahmadi smiled, the first genuine warmth Marcus had seen from any of the local staff. "You are different from the others. They see only enemies. You try to see people." That difference became apparent during Marcus's first patrol into the nearby village of Kalet. As they moved through the narrow streets, Morrison kept the squad in tight formation, weapons ready but not openly threatening. The village was a maze of mud brick buildings and narrow alleys, with children peering out from doorways and old men sitting in whatever shade they could find. "Stay alert," Morrison whispered into his radio. "Intel says there might be IED activity in this area." Marcus found himself naturally gravitating toward the children, offering small waves and trying out his limited Pashto. "Salam alaikum," he said to a group of kids who'd been following them at a distance. "Alaikum salam," they replied, their faces breaking into surprised smiles at hearing their language from an American soldier. "Rodriguez, get back in formation," Morrison called out, but his tone lacked the sharp edge Marcus had expected. As they continued through the village, Marcus noticed something the others had missed. An old man sitting by a tea stand kept glancing nervously toward a particular alley, and every time American soldiers approached, he would look away quickly. It wasn't hostility in his expression, but fear. "Sergeant," Marcus called out quietly, "I think something's wrong with that alley up ahead." Morrison followed Marcus's gaze and saw the same nervous behavior. The old man's eyes kept darting between the soldiers and the shadowy entrance to the alley, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite sitting in the shade. "What makes you think that?" Morrison asked, respecting Marcus's observation enough to take it seriously. The old man by the tea stand. "Look at his body language. He's not angry or hostile. He's scared, and he keeps looking at that alley like he's trying to warn us without being obvious about it." Morrison studied the situation for a moment, then made a decision that would change how the entire squad viewed their smallest member. Instead of dismissing Marcus's concern, he called for a route change, leading the patrol down a different street entirely. 20 minutes later, as they were heading back to base, a massive explosion shook the ground behind them. The alley Marcus had identified had been destroyed by a remotely detonated IED that would have killed or wounded the entire squad. The ambush came without warning on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Marcus was on his 4th month of deployment, and Alpha Squad had been tasked with escorting a convoy of supplies to a remote outpost near the Pakistani border. The mountain road wound through narrow passes where ancient rocks jutted out like broken teeth, creating perfect hiding spots for insurgents. Marcus sat in the back of the lead Humvee, his rifle across his lap and scanning the ridge lines through his scope. His earlier success in identifying the IED threat had earned him grudging respect from his squad mates, but he still felt the weight of proving himself with every mission. "Contact left," Hayes' voice exploded over the radio, just as the first RPG streaked across the road, missing their vehicle by mere feet and exploding against the rock wall. The convoy came to a grinding halt as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions along the ridge. Marcus could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper rattle of machine gun fire. Bullets sparked off the armored sides of their vehicle like deadly rain. "Everyone out! Take cover behind the vehicles!" Morrison shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus rolled out of the Humvee and pressed himself against the rear wheel, his heart hammering so hard he was sure the enemy could hear it. This was nothing like the training exercises back at Fort Benning. The bullets weren't blanks, and the explosions sent real shrapnel whistling through the air. "We've got them in an L-shaped ambush," Morrison called out, his voice strained as he tried to coordinate their response. "Hayes, put suppressive fire on that ridge. Rodriguez, Williams, cover the right flank." Through the din of gunfire, Marcus could hear something that made his blood run cold. American voices calling for help from the second vehicle in the convoy. The Humvee had taken a direct hit from an RPG and was smoking heavily. He could see figures moving inside, but they weren't getting out. "Sergeant!" Marcus shouted over the noise. "Second vehicle's in trouble." Morrison looked back and cursed under his breath. The second Humvee was trapped in the kill zone, taking concentrated fire from at least 3 positions. Anyone who tried to reach it would have to cross 30 yards of open ground while under direct enemy observation. "We need to get to them." Williams, their medic, started to move toward the trapped vehicle, but Morrison grabbed his arm. "Negative. It's suicide to cross that open ground. We'll get picked off before we make it halfway." Marcus studied the terrain, his mind racing. The enemy positions were focused on the road, but there was a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the convoy route, partially hidden by scrub brush and rocks. It would mean crawling through 50 yards of rough terrain while under fire, but it might, just might, provide enough concealment to reach the trapped soldiers. "Sergeant, I can get to them," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the fear coursing through his veins. Morrison looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Rodriguez, you'll get yourself killed. Those positions have overlapping fields of fire." "Not if I use the drainage ditch." Marcus pointed toward the depression in the ground. "It's not perfect cover, but it's better than trying to cross in the open." Another explosion rocked the convoy as his second RPG impacted near the trapped vehicle. Through the smoke, Marcus could see that the Humvee was now on fire, and he could hear screaming from inside. "There's no time to argue," Marcus said, already moving toward the ditch. "Cover me." Before Morrison could stop him, Marcus had rolled into the drainage ditch and begun crawling toward the burning vehicle. The ditch was filled with rocks and thorny bushes that tore at his uniform, and every few yards he had to press himself flat as bullets whistled overhead. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "You have something they cannot see yet, but one day they will." As he crawled through the dirt and debris, Marcus realized what that something was. It wasn't size or strength. It was the willingness to do what needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. The crawl to the second vehicle felt like it took hours, though it was probably less than 5 minutes. When Marcus finally reached the burning Humvee, he found 3 soldiers trapped inside. The driver, a young private named Collins, was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a head wound. The gunner, Sergeant Davis, had a compound fracture of his left arm and was trying to drag Collins from the vehicle while return fire with his good hand. "Rodriguez!" Davis looked shocked to see him. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Getting you out," Marcus replied, immediately moving to help extract Collins from the vehicle. The private was dead weight, and with Davis injured, it would have been impossible for one person to move him. As they worked to free Collins, Marcus could hear the enemy fire intensifying. The insurgents had spotted his movement and were concentrating their fire on the disabled vehicle. Bullets rang off the armor plating like hail on a tin roof. "We need to move now," Marcus said, shouldering Collins's unconscious form. The fuel tank could go any second. Supporting Davis with one arm and carrying Collins, Marcus began the agonizing journey back toward their lines. But instead of using the drainage ditch again, he made a decision that surprised everyone watching. He stood up and began walking directly across the open ground, making himself a clear target. "What are you doing?" Davis gasped. "They'll cut us down." "No," Marcus replied with quiet certainty. "They won't." He had observed something during his months of studying the enemy's tactics. The insurgents were disciplined fighters, but they followed patterns. When presented with multiple targets, they prioritized threats in a predictable order. Machine gunners first, then riflemen, then officers. A single soldier carrying wounded posed no immediate threat to their positions. As they crossed the killing ground, Marcus could see muzzle flashes from the ridge, but the enemy fire was focused on Hayes's machine gun position and Morrison's squad. They were being ignored as non-threats. The gamble paid off. Marcus reached their defensive position with both wounded soldiers, collapsing behind the lead vehicle as his squad mates provided covering fire. Williams immediately went to work on Collins and Davis, while Morrison stared at Marcus with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest," Morrison said as the firefight continued around them. Marcus was too exhausted to respond, but as he reloaded his rifle and prepared to rejoin the fight, he noticed something had changed. The other soldiers were looking at him differently now, not with mockery or doubt, but with respect. 2 years had passed since that firefight in the Afghan mountains, and Marcus Rodriguez found himself standing in dress uniform in the rose garden of the White House, surrounded by his family, fellow soldiers, and dignitaries. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows across the manicured lawn, where the most significant moment of his life was about to unfold. His grandmother Elena sat in the front row, her weathered hands clutching a tissue, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Beside her sat his squad mates from Afghanistan. Morrison, now a master sergeant; Hayes, who'd lost his left leg to an IED 6 months after Marcus's rescue, but refused to let it slow him down; and Williams, who'd left the Army to become a physician's assistant back in Kentucky. Even Johnson and Peterson from basic training had made the journey to Washington, their faces showing a respect that Marcus never could have imagined during those difficult early days. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president's voice carried clearly across the garden, "today we gather to honor extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Medal of Honor is our nation's highest decoration for valor in combat, reserved for those who demonstrate conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Marcus stood at attention, his mind drifting back to the mission that had brought him here. It hadn't been the convoy rescue that earned him this recognition. That action had earned him a Bronze Star with V device for valor. No, the Medal of Honor had come from what happened 3 months later, during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. Alpha Squad had been conducting a census operation in a remote village when intelligence reports came in about a possible Taliban commander hiding in the area. What they'd found instead was something far worse: a school that had been taken over by insurgents, with 43 children and 6 teachers held hostage inside. The rules of engagement were clear: no direct assault on a building containing civilians. The official plan was to establish a perimeter and wait for specialized hostage rescue teams to arrive from Kandahar. But the Taliban fighters had made it clear they would begin executing hostages if American forces didn't withdraw within 1 hour. Marcus had volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission, infiltrating the school building alone to gather intelligence on the hostage situation. What he'd found was a nightmare. Children as young as 6 years old tied up in classrooms, crying for their mothers, while armed men argued about which ones to kill first as an example. Using the Pashto he'd learned from Ahmadi, Marcus had managed to pose as a local villager long enough to determine that there were only 4 insurgents inside the building, all positioned in different rooms. He'd also discovered that the explosives they claimed to have were actually fake, old artillery shells that had been rendered inert. The decision he'd made in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life, but it was also what made him a hero. Instead of reporting back to his squad, Marcus had stayed inside the building and systematically eliminated each insurgent, moving room by room with nothing but his sidearm and the knowledge that any mistake would result in dead children. The actions of Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez on November 15th exemplify the very best of American military tradition, the president continued, his voice growing more solemn. Facing insurmountable odds, and with complete disregard for his own safety, he single-handedly neutralized 4 enemy combatants and rescued 49 hostages, including 43 children. Marcus's throat tightened as he remembered the moment when it was over. 43 pairs of frightened eyes looking up at him as he cut their bonds, their teacher whispering prayers of gratitude in Pashto. The youngest had been a little girl named Zara, no more than 7 years old, who had wrapped her tiny arms around his neck and wouldn't let go until her parents arrived. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's courage saved 49 innocent lives and demonstrated that heroism isn't measured in size or strength, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for others. As the president approached to place the medal around his neck, Marcus thought about all the people who had doubted him along the way, Drill Sergeant Williams, who'd told him he'd never make it past basic training, the classmates who'd bet on when he'd wash out, the fellow soldiers who'd seen him as a liability rather than an asset. But he also thought about the people who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. His grandmother Elena, whose stories of family military service had inspired him to enlist. Staff Sergeant Morrison, who'd been the first person to see past his size and recognize his potential. Ahmadi, who'd taught him that understanding people was just as important as understanding tactics. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, the president read from the citation. The Medal of Honor is presented to Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez. As the medal settled around his neck, Marcus felt the weight of more than just the bronze star and ribbon. He felt the weight of responsibility, of representing everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough, big enough, strong enough, or brave enough to make a difference. The ceremony continued with speeches and congratulations, but Marcus's attention was drawn to the crowd of faces before him. In the front row, his grandmother was openly weeping with pride. Behind her, he could see Drill Sergeant Williams, now retired, who had traveled from Georgia to attend the ceremony. Their eyes met, and Williams gave him a subtle nod of respect that meant more than any medal ever could. After the formal ceremony, as guests mingled in the rose garden, Johnson approached Marcus with an expression of genuine humility. "Hey, Rodriguez," Johnson said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies for how I treated you in basic." Marcus shook his hand, feeling no anger or resentment. "We all grow up, Johnson. You didn't know who I was back then. Hell, I didn't know who I was back then." "Yeah, but you figured it out," Johnson replied. "And because you did, 43 kids got to go home to their families. That's something I'll never be able to say about my service." As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Marcus found himself standing alone with his grandmother under an old oak tree. She looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears, and a pride so fierce it seemed to radiate from her small frame. "Mijo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember what I told you before you left for the army?" Marcus nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "You said I had something they couldn't see yet, but one day they would." Elena smiled and reached up to touch the medal hanging around his neck. "Today, the whole world sees it.